I'm going to be talking, as you can see, about Rosenwald Schools on plantations. And you might be thinking, weren't Rosenwald Schools public schools, and weren't white planters some of the people who were most opposed to the education of African Americans in the post-Civil War South? And I guess the answers to both those questions are yes, but it's complicated. And so let me explain a little bit about what I'm talking about and what I'm going to do this morning. When I talk about a plantation Rosenwald school, what I mean is a school that was built, it was a public school and a Rosenwald school, but it was on or within a plantation that or sometimes was associated directly with a plantation, usually built with the collaboration of the plantation owner, sometimes at their initiation. I'm going to talk about these schools in terms of the precedents for them and the motives. And in Jennifer's presentation in the previous session, she was talking about how sometimes the motives are a little ambiguous. And when you talk about why people would want to support spending money on public schools for African Americans in the era of Jim Crow, that's just as true during the Rosenwald period, I would argue. So I'll talk about some general motives and then a very specific precedent. And then I'll start talking more about the collaboration between Rosenwald School advocates and plantation owners. So in terms of precedents and motives, I think the first, the foremost, and always the most important precedent and motive goes back to the issue of black self-help and the determination to secure an education as part of the long-term struggle for freedom and rights. And there's no way to underestimate the importance of this motive, this precedent. It is what underlies everything that happens from the 19th century to the present day. And in fact, the Rosenwald program depended on this, assumed its existence, and appropriated it to its own purposes. But we can see this very early on. You know, Booker T. Washington talked all the time about self-help, but he never invented it. It's the tradition he was raised up in. And so you see here a quote from a book by Whitelaw Reid. He was a northern politician and journalist. He toured the immediate post-Civil War South, and in the midst of what's actually a very condescending discussion of newly emancipated people that he met in 1866, he does note that on some plantations they had asked the owners of those plantations to take money out of their wages so that a school teacher could be hired. And essentially what they're doing is they're holding the planter hostage. We will not work for you unless you allow us to make some provision for our children's education. So this is the tradition that underlies everything that I'll be talking about today. Now, as I said, Booker T. Washington didn't invent self-help. His genius was to tie black self-help to white self-interest. And this is a letter that Booker T. Washington wrote to the editor of the Washington Post in 1910 after the Post ran a story about how Southern planters were bemoaning the fact that many of their sharecroppers were moving away. And Booker T. Washington writes to you in response, here's what's in your best interest, white landlords. You will never hold on to your labor force, that best class of labor, unless you provide a good public school with a good teacher, a good schoolhouse, and a school term lasting from 7 to 8 or 9 months. And notice he doesn't say build a private school, have a school of your own. He says a public school, this kind of facility. So he's showing us the white self-interest component. Now there's another component or precedent that I wanted to talk about, and that's white nostalgia. In the early 20th century, there's a lot of white nostalgia for the moonlight and the magnolias, the lost cause, the good old days on the plantation that had gone away. And sometimes advocates for Rosenwald schools some of the white advocates at least believe this, and were using it to reach other whites. So in this case, the man you see on the left is Alabama's first state agent for Negro schools, James Longstreet Sibley. This is a picture taken on his family plantation that he had inherited in 1917 with one of the tenants on his plantation. Now, Sibley himself, he was a genuine supporter of black public education, but he promoted it as a resumption of the pre-Civil War Plantation School. And in an essay he wrote for the State Department of Education, as you see here, he says, before the Civil War, essentially plantations were nothing but big vocational schools for African Americans, and after the Civil War, that's what we lost. And then in the next section, he's talking about, well, let's resume this with a new kind of plantation school. And here he says, the plantation school of the one-teacher type as exemplified by the average Rosenwald school has been designed now. So we resume that tradition. So these are some of the general traditions that people are calling upon as they think about plantation Rosenwald schools. There's another very specific precedent for this. Now, I don't need to tell you that behind every great man, there's a great woman. And behind Booker T. Washington, there are several great women, among them Margaret Murray Washington, his third wife. Maggie, or Margaret Murray Washington, was a real force in her own right, and she was the founder of the Tuskegee Women's Club in 1895. And she and the members of the Tuskegee Women's Club created what would become an early Rosenwald Plantation School, the Elizabeth Russell Plantation School, and the Russell Plantation Project. And Booker T. Washington showed this off to people who came to visit Tuskegee. It was widely known in its own time and up through the 1920s. Essentially what Margaret Murray Washington and the Tuskegee Women's Club were doing is going to this plantation and setting up their own sort of settlement project. And I should explain the Elizabeth Russell Plantation was about a 1,400-acre plantation with about 30 families living on it that was part actually of a much larger multi-unit plantation in Macon County. And it was not an organic sharecropper community. Many people, particularly the male heads of households, and you can see some of the students here are adults, they had been former convicts. And in some sources indicate that some members of this plantation community were still convicts who were released out of the prison system, and they're working off their prison terms as plantation workers. This happened, of course, all through the South. So these are some of the precedents that then allowed the Rosenwald School advocates to go out and build relationships with planters and convince them that it was in their self-interest. And they found that some planters were receptive to this as they tried to adapt to the modern business world of the New South. So, for example, in 1914, the Alabama Department of Education does a survey. They pick up Macon County as a sample black belt county, and they write in this report, it's illustrated with this example of a plantation school. They say, planters, essentially what Booker T. Washington has already told you is true. If you want to remain in business, you're going to have to do something more to educate the children on your plantation, or your labor force is simply going to leave, and then you won't be able to modernize the plantation operation itself. Also, Rosenwald School advocates, like state agents for Negro schools, used Rosenwald schools on plantations sort of as carrots to dangle in front of other people. See, this is what your rivals are doing in other counties. So James Longstreet Sibley writes to a school superintendent in Dallas County and says, hey, look, you need to build Rosenwald schools because Lowndes County, which is a very backward county, he says, and sort of an understatement right there, but says Lowndes County is doing this already. And he points to probate judge and plantation owner J.C. Wood. Says, Judge Wood, he's met Julius Rosenwald when Julius Rosenwald has come to visit Tuskegee. He's cooperating with the school superintendent. They've got 7 Rosenwald schools under construction, including one on the wood plantation. And by the way, he's a big supporter of the Lowndes County Training School, which you see here. And to put in a plug for the Fisk University database, there is nothing we could do without this, the database being available to us today. It's not just the state agents for Negro schools, it's the Rosenwald building agents. Booker T. Washington's son, Booker T. Washington Jr., usually called Baker Washington, when he was a Rosenwald building agent in Alabama, reported on how he tried to recruit the best class of whites, the leading whites, to support Rosenwald schools. And again, this is a lure to whites. You want to be in that best class. So he says, I made a personal visit to the leading whites, getting them interested in the Rosenwald Fund. I inspected a school that's already under construction on the Harper Plantation. They're donating their labor. Now, the Harper Plantation School went by without any incident. What's interesting is what Booker T. Washington Jr. also reported about the Dorsey Plantation School, which ran into a little bit of trouble for a while. Sorry, there's not a picture of this one, but the contractor for this school was the head of the white board of trustees for the school district. And he started to construct the school, and then he stopped. He said, I'm not doing it without you paying me more money, because this school is going to be better than the white school in my district. And so he at least wanted more money to make it worth his while to get into trouble with the whites in his school district. Also, Clement Richardson, who was the head of the English division at Tuskegee Institute, wrote a very interesting article for the Southern Workman on what he considered a model Rosenwald rural school. This is the Uchee Valley School. I have trouble matching it up with the Russell County list, but it goes into great detail about this. It's the brainchild of Frank de Graffenried, who was both a planter and the county school superintendent. There were 2 black schools in the vicinity that many of his tenants sent their children to. Both of those school communities wanted new buildings, but neither one could afford to do a Rosenwald school. So de Graffenried, working with the Tuskegee officials for the Rosenwald program, said, how about if we consolidate you and build a Rosenwald school on my plantation? I'll donate some cash. I'll donate 5 acres of land for you to build this school on. And then they hire a new teacher who is a Tuskegee alumnus. So he donates trees as well as the acres of land. Then the patrons saw the lumber, the school's constructed. They have a Tuskegee-style curriculum again, and you can see they're cultivating some of the land right up to the school itself. What's interesting is that this teacher sets then up a plantation on the plantation because he's got a night school class of adult learners, and the teacher forges a deal with de Graffenried that they will work another 40 acres of that plantation. And de Graffenried splits the proceeds with the night school students. So the night school students divide up their 50% among themselves. The other 50% goes to de Graffenried, which then he uses to pay for the salary and the upkeep for running the school on the plantation, which is a sort of interesting feedback loop there. But this is the basis on which, again, they're going to use an existing Rosenwald school on a plantation as a little carrot to dangle in front of everybody else. Clement Richardson claims that de Graffenried was initially scoffed at, complained about by some of his plantation neighbors who said this is going to spoil the farmhands. Of course, this was typical language that education would spoil or ruin African-American sharecroppers. But once that school is up and they see that people are staying, instead now all the planters, they claim, want to have a school on their plantation next. Emmett Scott, who was Booker T. Washington's secretary while Washington was alive, he too repeats this kind of rhetoric in an article for Outlook magazine in 1918. He says, of course, in the midst of this great migration that's underway, how are you going to keep African Americans on Southern farms? And he goes back, probably pointing to DeGraff and Reed again. White neighbors criticized a farmer for building a Rosenwald school. Now each farmer is clamoring for a schoolhouse on his place. What brought me back to the Rosenwald Schools on Plantations, because I wrote about them a little bit in my book, was the research I'm doing now on Jean's teachers in Autauga County, which sits just above the Alabama Black Belt. She was working in the late 1910s, early 1920s with 4 different plantation owners, each of whom wanted a Rosenwald school. Mrs. J.M. Green at Peace, Alabama, who was ready to donate land and all the lumber like DeGraff and Reed had done. Another plantation owned by State Senator Howard Doster, who would shut down work on his plantation so that workers could attend Tuskegee's farmers' conferences. She also worked with a plantation owner named Dick Hicks, who was one of the white supporters of this project, the Autauga County Training School, that dragged on for years, but he donated the land and a lot of cash for this. The big fish she had on her line was McQueen Smith. His plantation house still stands, a very wealthy Autauga family plantation owner. He died in 1917, just after starting discussions about building a Rosenwald school, but his widow, his sons, their wives, they were all behind this. And what they wanted to do was to have something much like the Elizabeth Russell plantation, have a Rosenwald school, a teacher's home, a sort of a practice farm, and to hire a woman who would be a combination public health nurse and social worker on the plantation. Now, what ultimately transpired is a little bit different, but they were able to replace the existing plantation school, which was a private school they ran on their plantation, with a public school, the McQueen Smith School. What is interesting, though, is that A. Wells Henderson, in her reports, both to Tuskegee and to the State Department of Education, about her work on this plantation, she says the usual things that, the Smith family, they're devoted to their people, their Negroes on the plantation, she says. But what I think is so interesting is what she tells you about the sharecroppers on the McQueen Smith plantation. She says many of these people are third-generation tenants on this plantation. And so that takes you right back to the first generation working in freedom. And so they've been there for generations. She said they talk about, to them, it's their plantation. They say, our plantation, our fields, our crops, our homes, our school, when they talk about the Smith plantation and what the school is going to be. And Tuskegee is still working with plantation owners. In the early 1920s, another Jeans teacher, the Macon County Jeans teacher, Mary Foster, writes to Robert Russell Moulton, the principal of Tuskegee Institute, to bring him into the loop about what will become the Macon County Training School, for which planter J.O. Thompson donated, again, the land and a good deal of cash. And she told Moulton, what he probably already knew, that actually there were several Tuskegee staff members already out visiting the plantation to plan this school, and that they'd already been in touch with the State Department of Education in Montgomery. They're well aware of the Rosenwald Fund. And she also says, one of the reasons Thompson is interested in this is that not only for workers on his own plantation, but that he's the only white resident on the road between Tuskegee and Hannon, Alabama. And so he sees this as something that's essential for the business operations all through his section of the county. Shifting left from the Black Belt to the Mississippi Delta, another plantation area. Well, in some ways, you couldn't help but have a plantation Rosenwald school. Those schools were going to be near plantations. But again, the planter class is being recruited, and Mississippi is making progress because so many planters want Rosenwald schools or Rosenwald-type schools. Clinton Calloway actually went out to Sunflower County in 1920, right after the shift of the Rosenwald program out of Tuskegee to Nashville. And there he met the landlord. Well, actually, the landlord here represents a corporation, the Taylor and Crate Company of Buffalo, New York, that owned the sunflower plantation. And notice this is whatever, they're going to pledge to furnish whatever money the tenants would be expected to put up. That term furnish is what should set off some little warning bells here. The plantation owners were furnishing merchants also. Right, so these are like company towns. You work for them, and then you buy all of your stuff at the plantation store that's owned by the landlord. So essentially, they're going to charge this as a debt against your landlord for you to participate in the Rosenwald School program. But this is what leads to the Sunflower Plantation School, which in the 1930s became a resettlement administration project. They took all sorts of pictures of the sunflower plantation, but not of the school. I could just kick them. But there's one of the 1930s pictures there. And as those of you who work on Rosenwald schools know, the rules of the Rosenwald program were one thing, but what happened sometimes was quite another. So in Coahoma County, on the Northfleet plantation, the Green Grove Rosenwald School was constructed, and supposedly the plantation owner had transferred the property to public school authorities in Coahoma County, but when he sold it to the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s, they found out that no, actually he hadn't. And this was a real problem because the Northfleet plantation was taken over as a project for white sharecroppers, and so all the black sharecroppers were kicked off this plantation and they lost their school to boot. So there are other schools like this that are scattered throughout the Rosenwald record, scattered and hidden within the Rosenwald school stories across the South, whether it's the Balzer School that sort of transferred back and forth between Coahoma and Sunflower County, or the Pleasance Industrial School, which was built because of the intense competition among planters to have Rosenwald schools in their communities to keep their tenants on their lands. So why should we worry about this? Well, as early as the 1930s, of course, the Rosenwald Fund itself was supporting studies that were documenting the implosion of the sharecropping system in the South, which then was devastated further after the introduction of the mechanical cotton picker, the post-World War II period. So today, now we see plantations being preserved as historic sites, even marketed for heritage tourism, museums to record the tenant experience, the sharecropping experience. So what I would like to do is to challenge those of us who work with Rosenwald schools to make sure that the schools are part of this story and to think about this very complicated piece of the Rosenwald school puzzle. Because I think what we see here with Plantation Rosenwald schools, it's where black self-help met white self-interest. It's also where real advancements in terms of education and a real dream of education and freedom also linked up with very real exploitation of people who were essentially mortgaging their lives for the sake of their children's future. So I will conclude here with that request that we keep working on this project, this kind of documentation project, and let my other speakers take over. Thank you.